The Westchester house smelled of expensive lilies and betrayal. I sat in the back row of Edward's funeral, clutching a cold Medicare card that had become my only identity. I spent 38 years caring for my husband. As his dementia deepened, my entire day became his wiping his forehead through the night, giving him his medication, holding his hand when he could no longer remember my name. That was my 38 years. And when he was gone, one thing was left for me. A legal notice. Excluded from inheritance. Before the dirt had even settled on his grave, my stepson Bryce called me into a Manhattan office and slid papers across the table. Your caregiving services have been calculated at market rate. The Westchester property transfers to the estate. He promised me a home. 38 years. Dad wasn't reliable toward the end. He never looked up. That's why we have documents. The house, the accounts, everything we had built together, all of it went to Bryce. What remained in my name was a worn-out cabin in the mountains and $14 in my bank account. If that hit close to home, please subscribe right now, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Give this a like, and good luck is coming your way. But Edward had left something hidden in that cabin. During his worst years, he had secretly recorded Bryce threatening him. If you don't sign, Lydia gets nothing. Those were Bryce's own words. Edward hid that recorder behind a fireplace stone, in a place only I would find. When that recording played in the courtroom, everything turned. The amendment is void, obtained by coercion. Assets frozen immediately. 38 years of erasure reduced to nothing in a single courtroom moment. I walked past Bryce without a word. But I keep thinking how many women are sitting in the cold right now, still waiting for someone to come. The kitchen had always been the loudest room in the house. Not loud in the way of voices or laughter, though there had been plenty of both across nearly 4 decades. But loud in the particular way that a well-used home makes itself known. The low percussion of the refrigerator. The tick and settle of the pipes behind the walls. The soft wheeze of the heating vents on a cold November morning. Lydia Thorne had learned the grammar of this house the way you learn the breathing patterns of someone you love, without effort, without thought. Until the day you realize that silence has a texture all its own. She stood at the granite island now, both palms flat against its surface, and felt the cold seep up through her skin. The stack of papers to her left had been there since Tuesday. Medicare Part D notices, mostly those pale blue envelopes with the government seal that always arrived in clusters. As if the system had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. She had sorted through them twice already, not because they required sorting, but because her hands needed something to do. Edward had always handled the paperwork. 38 years of marriage, and she could count on one hand the number of times she had opened a piece of official mail without him standing behind her, reading over her shoulder, pointing to the important lines with the blunt tip of his architect's pencil. The ashes were still on the mantel. She hadn't moved them. She wasn't sure she was supposed to. Nobody had told her what the rules were, and she had spent so long following the rules of caregiving, the medication schedule, the appointment calendar. The careful choreography of a life organized around another person's diminishing capacities, that she found herself standing very still in the middle of her own kitchen. Not quite sure what she was allowed to do next. From the hallway, Bryce's voice carried clearly through the half-open door. He was on a conference call. He was always on a conference call. Even during the final weeks, when the hospice nurse had come 3 times a week. And the house had taken on that particular hush of anticipation that precedes the inevitable, Bryce had been somewhere with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice carrying the flat, efficient cadence of a man who measured the world in quarterly projections. Lydia had tried not to listen. She had tried very hard not to listen. She listened now. The Westchester property is the primary asset. Once we get the estate through probate, we can move on the liquidation timeline. The market's soft, but not so soft we can't. She pressed her palms harder against the marble. He was talking about the house. He was standing 40 feet away from his father's ashes, in the hallway of the house. Where his father had drawn blueprints on Sunday mornings and fallen asleep in the armchair every evening for the last decade, and he was talking about liquidation timelines. The word sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. She told herself he was just overwhelmed. People processed grief in different ways. She had read that somewhere in one of the pamphlets. The hospice social worker had left behind, the ones with the soft watercolor covers and the reassuring titles. Everyone moves through loss at their own pace. She had believed it then. She was working very hard to believe it now. The refrigerator cycled off, and the kitchen fell into a silence so complete. She could hear the faint scratch of a tree branch against the window above the sink. She moved to the cabinet beside the stove, the one she had reorganized 11 times in the last 4 years, each reorganization a small act of control in a household where so much had slipped beyond her reach. The pill organizer was on the second shelf. She had put it there last week without thinking, the way you put down a tool you've used so long it has become an extension of your hand. 7 compartments, each one labeled in her own neat handwriting S, M, T, W, T, F, S. Monday through Sunday, half of them were still full. She stood there a moment, looking at the small plastic squares, at the chalky white tablets and the oblong yellow capsules that had governed her mornings for longer than she could clearly remember. Her eyes filled without her permission. She blinked, and the tears retreated, and she was grateful, she was always grateful that her body still obeyed her in most of the ways that mattered. She had been a caregiver long enough to know that grief does not arrive all at once. It comes in increments, in the shape of a half-full pill organizer on a Tuesday morning. In the low, lonely hum of a refrigerator that no one else is around to hear. Bryce's voice rose briefly in the hallway, something about projected returns, and then fell again to its professional murmur. When she had asked him that morning about the grocery delivery, he had barely looked up from his laptop. The accounts, he explained, were under review. It was a normal part of the estate process. She shouldn't worry about it. He had said that last part the way you say it to someone whose worry you have already factored into your plans. And dismissed efficiently, without malice, without room for follow-up. She had nodded. She had gone back to the kitchen. She was still in the kitchen. The sun moved behind a cloud, and the light through the window above the sink shifted from pale gold to a flat, diffuse gray. The Westchester sky in November had always had a certain quality of muted severity that she had grown to associate with introspection rather than depression. A sky that asked you to sit with things. She had sat with a great many things in this kitchen over the years. She had sat with diagnoses and second opinions and the quiet devastation of watching a man's mind begin its long withdrawal from the world. She had sat with her own fear, many times, and managed to talk it down from whatever ledge it had climbed onto. And go back to the business of caring for someone who needed her. She was not sure, standing here now, who was going to care for her. The thought arrived without drama. That was the worst part of it. It didn't crash into her or announce itself with the weight she felt it deserved. It just settled, like dust settles after a disturbance, quietly, evenly, across every surface. She set the pill organizer on the counter, picked it back up, walked to the waste bin beneath the sink and pressed the lever with her foot. The lid swung up, releasing the faint smell of coffee grounds and yesterday's dinner. She held the pill organizer over the opening. Her hand wouldn't let go of the lid. She stood there for a long moment, her foot on the lever, her hand on the lid, the pill organizer suspended above the dark interior of the waste bin, and she understood, without being able to articulate it clearly, that the act of putting it away was a kind of statement she was not yet prepared to make. That keeping it was irrational. That irrational was sometimes the only sane response to a situation that had no good options. She set it back on the counter. In the hallway, Bryce ended his call. She heard the particular silence that followed the brief reorganization of a person preparing to move from one mode of engagement to another. She straightened without thinking about it. She reached for the stack of Medicare notices and aligned their edges against the granite with the automatic precision of a woman who had learned, long ago. That composure was a thing you wore on the outside even when the inside was something else entirely. His footsteps passed the kitchen doorway. He did not look in. The refrigerator began its low, humming cycle again, and the house resumed its conversation with itself. Pipes and vents and the distant creak of the upper landing, while Lydia Thorne stood at the granite island with her hands folded around a stack of government envelopes. Listening to the particular silence of a house that no longer breathed the way it used to, feeling the cold of the marble. Moving steadily up through her palms, and thinking about a word she had never had cause to fear before. Liquidation. She had never been more alone in a full house. And somewhere beneath the numbness, beneath the careful composure and the folded hands and the 11 times she had reorganized that cabinet, something small and persistent had begun to stir, not yet courage, not yet anger, but the quiet, cellular refusal of a woman who had survived too much to disappear quietly into someone else's timeline. She just didn't know it yet. The drive into Manhattan took an hour and 40 minutes on a good day. This was not a good day. Lydia had not been to the city since the spring, since the last time. Edward had been well enough to want something from the world beyond their Westchester neighborhood, when she had driven him to his old firm in Midtown. Just to sit in the lobby and look at the framed blueprints on the wall, the ones from projects he'd spent decades on and could no longer name. She had held his hand in the elevator. He had pressed her fingers with a firmness that surprised her, and said, quite clearly, as if the thought had surfaced from some undisturbed pool beneath all the confusion, "You are the best thing I ever built." She had laughed, and then immediately looked away so he wouldn't see her cry. She thought about that in the car, watching the skyline assemble itself through the windshield as she crossed the bridge. The towers rising gray and indifferent against the flat November sky. Bryce had called the meeting for 10 o'clock. He had not asked if 10 o'clock worked for her. He had said, in the particular tone he used for logistics, that his attorney had a window on Thursday morning and they needed to handle some estate formalities. He had used the word formalities the way people use medical jargon. They haven't fully understood, confidently, loosely, with just enough precision to foreclose further questions. She wore the charcoal blazer she had saved for Edward's hospital appointments. It still smelled faintly of the car, and of the particular nervous energy she associated with rooms where important things were decided about her life. The office was on the 34th floor of a building near Bryant Park. Glass walls, low furniture in shades of pale gray and bone white, the kind of aesthetic that communicates power through the conspicuous absence of warmth. A receptionist offered her water and then did not bring it. She sat in a chair that was beautiful and deeply uncomfortable, her worn leather wallet in her lap, her fingers working the clasp the way they had worked the edge of every waiting room surface for 4 years. She opened the wallet briefly. Her driver's license, a library card, a photograph of Edward from 1994 that she had trimmed to fit behind the plastic sleeve taken the summer they spent a week in the Outer Banks. His hair still mostly brown, his laugh still unguarded. She pressed the wallet closed again. The attorney's name was Gerald Whitmore. He was perhaps 60, with the cultivated blandness of a man who had spent a career delivering bad news in a tone calibrated to prevent emotional responses that might complicate the paperwork. Bryce sat to his left, his jacket perfectly pressed, his expression arranged into something that resembled concern but operated more like neutrality. Whitmore slid a document across the table. It was thick, perhaps 30 pages, bound at the left margin with a heavy black clip. On the cover, in clean serif type, prenuptial agreement amendment and addendum. Notarized. Dated. Lydia looked at the date. She looked at it again. June of the previous year. 3 months after Edward's dementia had progressed to the stage where he had stopped recognizing the faces on the television. 2 months after the hospice team had first been contacted. 1 month after he had called her by his first wife's name for an entire week. A development that had broken something in her that she had quietly reassembled, piece by piece, over the following days. This amendment, Whitmore said, smoothing the cover page with a practiced hand, was executed with Mr. Thorne's full legal consent at the time of signing. It addresses the disposition of the primary marital property, specifically, the Westchester residence, in the event of his death. Lydia did not move. He couldn't have signed this, she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. Last June, he didn't always know where he was. He had good days, Bryce said. Not unkindly. That was almost the worst part. Whitmore turned to a flagged page near the center of the document. The language was dense, the kind of legal prose designed not to illuminate but to exhaust, clause stacked upon clause. Each one bracketed by qualifications that sent you back to the beginning before you could reach the end. But she could read. She had been reading difficult documents for 4 years. She found the relevant paragraph, and she read it, and then she read it again, and the air in the room did something it had no right to do. It thinned. It contracted. It left her with the strange sensation of being in a pressurized space where the oxygen was present but somehow unavailable. The life estate was gone. She had lived in that house for 38 years. She had refinished the kitchen cabinets herself in the summer of 2004. Sanding them down to bare wood and starting over because she hadn't liked the way the first coat went on. She had planted the hydrangeas along the back fence and nursed them through 2 droughts. She had repainted the bedroom ceiling twice, once when the humidity warped the original plaster, and once simply because Edward had said, very quietly, one winter morning, that he thought a slightly warmer shade might help him sleep. The amendment stripped all of that from her. What about he always said I would have the house, she began. Her voice had developed a slight catch she couldn't entirely control. He told me I would always have a home. Verbal assurances, Whitmore said, are not legally binding in the absence of written documentation consistent with the current estate framework. Bryce uncapped a pen and turned it once between his fingers. There's also the matter of compensation, he said. For your caregiving services over the past several years. We've calculated a reasonable figure based on prevailing home care market rates, adjusted for the room and board provided during that period. She looked at him. Caregiving services. It's standard in estate settlements of this complexity. I was his wife, and that relationship is accounted for in the primary bequest. He nodded toward another flagged section of the document. The stipend covers the caregiving component. The number, when she found it, was not a large number. Whitmore informed her, with the same measured neutrality, that the stipend had already been applied by Bryce's direction to offset the funeral costs. Which had been substantial. Which she was, he implied, fortunate not to be responsible for directly. She pulled the wallet from her lap. She didn't know why. Some automatic gesture, some reaching for a self that existed outside of this room. And these pale gray walls and this document with its careful, suffocating language. She held the worn leather between both hands and looked at Gerald Whitmore's face and thought about the photograph of Edward inside. The one from the Outer Banks, the summer his hair was still mostly brown. Bryce, she said, and her voice had gone very quiet. The way it went when she was working to hold something together from the inside, your father promised me I would always have a home. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. My father, Bryce said, was not always in a position to make reliable promises toward the end. That's part of why we need these documents. To protect everyone. The pen clicked on the table. Whitmore's pen. A rhythmic, unhurried sound, like a metronome set to a tempo that had nothing to do with her. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table. She didn't realize she'd done it until she felt the strain across her knuckles, the white pressure of her own grip. She looked down at her hands. The hands that had administered medication at 3 in the morning. That had guided a man who no longer remembered his own address into the bathroom, into the car. Into the terrifying gentleness of a life that required constant tending. These hands had done that work for years without complaint, without calculation. Without once converting the hours into a dollar figure and presenting them as a line item across a polished table. She released the edge of the table. She straightened in the chair. Whitmore said something about the timeline for the probate process. Bryce said something about the Westchester property being listed before the end of the quarter. She heard these things from what felt like a considerable distance, as if the room had expanded around her while she remained in place. She was not a wife in this room. She understood that now with a clarity that felt almost physical, the way certain truths do when they finally break through the surface, not like revelations but like diagnoses. Something the doctor's expression had been telling you for several minutes before the words arrived. She was a liability, carefully dressed as a beneficiary. She was a loose end that had been tied, neatly, in June. In a document signed by a man who could not always recall his own address, in a room she had not been invited to enter. She gathered her coat from the back of the chair. She placed the wallet back in her purse. She said, very carefully, that she would need to consult with her own attorney before signing anything. She said it in the voice she had learned in waiting rooms and intake offices and every formal space where composure was the only currency left to spend. Whitmore nodded. He told her there was no urgency on her part. The estate timeline would proceed regardless. She thanked him. She stood. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Bryce's phone vibrate softly on the table, and the immediate, reflexive shift of his attention toward it, the small, unconscious adjustment of a man whose world was already, fully, somewhere else. She pressed the elevator button and waited, her purse held against her side, her eyes fixed on the polished metal doors. When they opened, she stepped inside. When they closed, she allowed herself, just briefly, to lean against the back wall and close her eyes. She had not cried in that room. She was extraordinarily proud of that fact. The elevator descended, and she descended with it, and somewhere between the 34th floor and the lobby, she began to understand that the thing she had told herself for 3 days, that Bryce was overwhelmed, that grief took many forms, that her husband's son was simply a man moving too fast through his own loss, was not a charitable interpretation. It was a story she had needed to believe. And the document upstairs, with its notarized date, and its market rate calculations and its polished legal language, had made it very difficult to go on believing it. The lobby doors opened onto Bryant Park. The cold hit her cleanly, directly, without ceremony. She pulled her coat around herself and walked toward the parking garage, and the city moved around her the way cities do, with complete indifference and tremendous noise. And she told herself to put one foot in front of the other, which she did, because that was what she knew how to do. The real estate agent arrived on a Thursday morning without calling ahead. Lydia heard the front door open. Bryce had given her a key, apparently, at some point, and then the particular sound of unfamiliar footsteps moving through the entry hall with the proprietary confidence of someone who has already mentally converted a home into square footage. She was still in the bedroom. She had been awake since 5, sitting in the chair by the window, the way she had done on 100 mornings during the caregiving years, when sleep was a luxury rationed by the rhythms of someone else's needs. She had not yet dressed. The agent was perhaps 40, efficient, pleasant in the brisk way of a person whose pleasantness is a professional tool rather than a personal quality. She carried a clipboard and a laser measure, a small red device that extended a beam of light across surfaces and converted them, instantly, into numbers. She introduced herself as Carla. She apologized for the early hour with an inflection that suggested she did not, in practice, find it problematic. "I'll just start with the master suite," she said, lifting the laser measure. "I won't be in your way." Lydia looked at her. "I'm not dressed." "Oh, I just need the dimensions." A small, professional smile. "I'll stay on this side of the room." She had managed the bedside, then. Not the bathroom, but the room where Edward had slept for 38 years, where the paint on the south wall was a color Lydia had chosen from a sample book on a rainy Saturday in 2007. Where the curtains were still the curtains she had hemmed herself because the ones from the store were 3 inches too long. That room was being measured around her while she stood in her nightgown holding her robe against her chest. She dressed in the bathroom with the door locked. She could hear the soft beep of the laser measure through the wall. There were things you could prepare yourself for, given enough warning. Lydia had come to understand this across years of receiving difficult information in difficult ways, diagnoses delivered in clinical language, prognoses offered in percentages, legal amendments produced from folders across polished tables. You could absorb these things if you had time to brace. What you could not, prepare yourself for what moved through the body in a different way. Entirely, sharper and more immediate was the thing that arrived without announcement and found you undressed. She came downstairs to find Carla in the kitchen, measuring the window above the sink. "Wonderful natural light," Carla said, noting something on her clipboard. Lydia put the kettle on. She did not offer Carla tea. The morning grew worse by increments, each one modest enough in isolation, collectively sufficient to produce something that functioned like vertigo. She drove to the CVS on Maple Street at 11, the same CVS she had used for 4 years. Where the pharmacist knew her name and had always set aside her prescriptions before she called, and stood at the counter with her health savings account card and a bottle of blood pressure medication. She had been refilling every 30 days since the 2nd year of Edward's illness. The pharmacist ran the card. The machine made a sound she did not recognize. "It's showing as inactive," he said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news they did not cause and cannot remedy. "Would you like to try another form of payment?" She stood very still at the counter. Behind her, a woman with a stroller shifted her weight impatiently. The fluorescent lights above the pharmacy counter were the specific shade of institutional white that makes everything look slightly unwell. "I'll come back," she said. She left the medication on the counter and walked out through the automatic doors into the parking lot, where the November light was flat and cold and indifferent. And she sat in the driver's seat of her car for 11 minutes without starting the engine, because she had learned, across many difficult years, that there were moments when the body required a brief cessation before it could be reasonably asked to continue. The accounts were under review. That was what Bryce had said. A normal part of the estate process. She started the car. She drove home. Bryce was waiting on the porch. He was holding a brown envelope, the padded kind used for documents, and he extended it toward her. As she came up the front walk with the particular economy of motion of a man who has accomplished something difficult on his schedule and would prefer not to linger in the aftermath. He was dressed for the city wool coat, dark trousers, the quiet assertion of expensive footwear on old porch boards. "This is the deed," he said. "For the property in Asheville." She took the envelope. She looked at it. "The cabin," he continued. "Dad bought it years ago, you probably remember. The estate is transferring it to you outright, free and clear. It should give you a solid base." She opened the envelope. Inside was a deed, a folded county tax notice from Buncombe County, North Carolina, and a single photograph printed on regular paper, slightly blurred, of a structure that appeared to be a small cabin, wood-sided, surrounded by dense tree cover, with what might have been a porch or might have been a lean-to addition distinguishable primarily by its listing angle. "I'd like you to be settled before the listing goes active," Bryce said. 2 weeks should be comfortable, realistically. Carla thinks we can move fast in this market if we stage it right. 2 weeks. She looked up from the photograph. He was already checking his phone. She wanted, in that moment, to say a great many things. She had been constructing them for days, these sentences measured, precise, the kind that Edward would have recognized as the concentrated form of something she had been quietly assembling for a long time. But the sentences stayed where they were, inside her, because she had also spent 40 years understanding the futility of trying to make a person feel the weight of something they had already decided not to carry. 2 weeks, she said. More than enough time to get sorted. He pocketed the phone. He had the grace, at least, to look at her when he said the next part. "Lydia, I know this is hard. But the estate has to be administered. Dad would have wanted it done cleanly." She said nothing. He nodded once, the nod of a man closing a conversational file, and went back inside. She stood on the porch. She looked at the deed in her hands. She looked at the street. 2 of the neighbors from the house across the way were standing on their front walk in coats, pretending to examine something in their landscaping. She had known them for 15 years. The wife had brought casseroles during the worst stretches of Edward's illness. They were not looking at the landscaping, they were watching her, with the careful attention people give to spectacle they feel guilty for observing but cannot bring themselves to stop. The sun was too bright for November. She was aware, acutely, of the fraying at the left cuff of her coat. A thing she had not bothered to repair because there had always been more pressing repairs to attend to. She was aware of the photograph in her hand, the slightly blurred image of a structure that was being offered to her as a home. The way you offer a person who asked for water a glass of something that is mostly ice. Inside the envelope, behind the deed and the tax notice, was a single folded sheet of paper. She opened it. It was an empty 401k account statement, her name, her account number, a balance of 0, and a transaction history that showed a full disbursement 18 months prior with a notation she would need a lawyer to properly decipher. He had printed it for her. He had considered that a kindness. She put the statement back in the envelope. She folded the envelope once and held it against her side. She walked to the car. She had left it in the driveway, the engine still warm, and she opened the trunk and took out the 2 suitcases. She had already half-packed, because she had understood, somewhere in the part of her that processed information before the rest of her was ready to act on it, that Thursday was going to be a day of packing. The neighbors were still watching. She was 68 years old. She had spent 38 of those years building something in this house, not wealth, or not only wealth. But the daily texture of a life constructed with care and intention and an enormous amount of quiet labor that had never been assigned a dollar value because it had never occurred to her to value it that way. She was the wife of 38 years. She was the woman who had sanded the kitchen cabinets and planted the hydrangeas and hemmed the curtains and administered the midnight medication and driven to the appointments and held the hand in the elevator. And heard the sentence she would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. "You are the best thing I ever built." She lifted the first suitcase and carried it to the car. She did not hurry. She did not look at the neighbors. She made 3 trips, 2 suitcases and a box of things she was not willing to leave for Carla to inventory, and she loaded them into the back of the sedan with the methodical calm of a woman who had learned, across many difficult years, that composure was not the same as surrender. She got into the driver's seat. She looked at the house for a moment, the front door, the porch where Bryce had stood with his envelope, the upstairs window of the room being measured this morning while she dressed in the bathroom with the door locked. She looked at the empty 401k statement in the passenger seat. She started the engine. She drove for 7 hours. Not because the distance required at Asheville was perhaps 5.5 hours from Westchester on a clear day, on a route she had taken twice before with Edward, in the early years, when the cabin had been a weekend idea rather than an inheritance. She drove the extra hour and a half because she missed the exit twice. And didn't correct either mistake immediately, because the part of her that normally managed navigation was occupied with other tasks. She stopped once, at a rest area near the Virginia border, and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Watching a man in a red windbreaker walk a very small dog in patient, methodical circles around the grass strip near the picnic tables. The dog seemed satisfied with this arrangement. She found it, for reasons she couldn't have articulated clearly, deeply comforting. She arrived at the cabin at 7:30 in the evening. The road up to it was unpaved for the final half-mile. And the sedan moved over the ruts and loose gravel with a reluctant rocking motion that made the box in the back shift and settle. The headlights found the structure through the trees, and it was a structure, in the sense that it occupied space and had 4 walls and a roof. But the word cabin implied a kind of intentional rusticity, a chosen simplicity, and what she found at the end of the unpaved road was something more accurately described as a building that had been allowed to make its own decisions for a number of years. The wood siding had gone gray. The porch, it was a porch, she could confirm that now, had a soft, uncertain quality to its boards that she tested before committing her full weight, and which held, but not in a way that inspired confidence. The front door required the key to be turned twice and then lifted slightly before it would release, and when it did, it released with the particular reluctant groan of a thing that had not been asked to perform this function in quite some time. The smell of the interior was old pine and damp, not mold, not quite, but the close relative of mold, the suggestion of it, the olfactory implication. There was old wood smoke beneath that, from a fireplace she could see at the far end of the main room, and beneath that something she couldn't name, but which her body registered as the smell of absence, of a space that had been holding itself in a state of suspension, waiting for something to happen that hadn't happened. She felt for a light switch. Found one. Pressed it. Nothing. She pressed it again, with the slightly increased pressure people apply to switches as if firmness might remedy the problem. Nothing. She moved to the lamp on the end table near the sofa, a pole lamp with a yellowed shade. The kind of furniture that accumulates in places where nobody is paying attention, and found the switch at its base and turned it. Nothing. She went back to the car and retrieved the flashlight from the glove compartment. She kept it there because during the caregiving years there had been any number of situations in which a flashlight at arm's reach had been the difference between a crisis managed and a crisis escalated. She was grateful now, in a way that felt slightly absurd, for a caregiving habit she had never expected to need again. The flashlight's beam found a piece of paper taped to the interior side of the front door. A utility notice. Disconnected service for non-payment, dated 6 weeks prior, with a reconnection fee listed at the bottom in a font size designed to discourage close reading. She sat down on the sofa. The sofa exhaled beneath her with the sound of something that has been compressed for a long time. Its upholstery was a pattern she associated with the 1980s, a geometric weave in shades of rust and forest green, and it had, in several places along the cushion seams, The characteristic thinning of fabric that occurs when a piece of furniture has exceeded its intended lifespan by some years. She pulled a blanket from the arm of the sofa, thin, acrylic. The kind that provides the appearance of warmth rather than its substance, and wrapped it around her shoulders. In her coat pocket, she had a sleeve of crackers she had bought at the rest area in Virginia. She opened it carefully and ate 3 crackers and then put the sleeve on the sofa cushion beside her. The flashlight, propped against the lamp base, illuminated a cone of the room in front of her, the cold fireplace. The peeling wallpaper beyond it, a faded pattern of small blue flowers on an ivory ground. And the shadows that gathered in the corners with a patience that she found, in her current state, particularly oppressive. She took out her phone and opened the banking app. She looked at the number for a long time. $14.12. She had known it was coming. She had watched the accounts in the weeks since the Manhattan meeting. Watched the way money she had believed was jointly held turned out not to be, the way assets she had believed were mutual turned out to exist in frameworks she had not been party to designing. She had known, but knowing a number intellectually and seeing it on a screen, in a cold room, alone, with crackers on the sofa, and a flashlight propped against a lamp that didn't work, was a different kind of knowing. The kind that sat at the base of the sternum. The Appalachian wind came off the mountains with a seriousness that the gaps in the window frames around the main room were entirely unprepared to resist. She could feel it moving through the room as a presence rather than a draft, a sustained, mournful pressure against the old wood. The kind of wind that sounded, in the dark, less like weather and more like something with intentions. She was 68 years old. She had a heart condition that was managed, at present, by medication she had not been able to pick up from the CVS on Maple Street 3 days ago. She had a blanket that was not warm enough and a flashlight with batteries of uncertain remaining life. And $14.12 in the only account she could access without a lawyer. "Is this where it ends?" she said, quietly, to the room. The room did not answer, but the wind offered a sustained and mournful commentary through the window frames that she chose not to interpret as encouraging. She reached into the pocket of her coat and found the pill organizer. She had brought it. She hadn't thought about bringing it. She had simply transferred the things from the bathroom counter to the overnight bag. And her hand had included the pill organizer without consulting her, the way hands do with objects they've had long enough to develop their own opinions about. 7 compartments. She counted the pills inside by flashlight. 6 days of blood pressure medication remaining. After that, the next refill was a conversation she hadn't yet figured out how to have. She held the organizer in both hands. The plastic was smooth and slightly warm from her pocket. She had pressed this same object 1,000 times, had filled and replenished it, carried it, tracked it, adjusted it as prescriptions changed, and it had always represented something she was managing for someone else. Now it was the thing being managed for her, and the person responsible for managing it was the same woman. Sitting on a sofa that smelled of dust, in a cold cabin on a mountain. In a state she had driven to because a man in a wool coat had handed her an envelope on a porch and considered that a satisfactory conclusion to 38 years. The flashlight flickered. She tightened her hold on the organizer. The light stabilized, then flickered again, a long, slow dimming that cast the shadows in the corners into larger, more elaborate versions of themselves before brightening briefly and then settling into a diminished but functional beam. She understood that the batteries were communicating something to her. She did not want to hear it. She looked at the fireplace. Dry wood, she could probably find in the morning. There were trees enough, certainly she had driven through several miles of them. For tonight, the blanket and the coat and whatever body heat she could retain through stillness would have to be sufficient. She was not the first person who had ever spent a cold night in an uncomfortable place. She was not fragile. She was 68, and she was cold, and she had $14.12 and 6 days of blood pressure medication, and she was not fragile. She told herself this several times, with the particular internal firmness of a person trying to convince themselves of a thing that is true but not yet fully felt. The wind moved through the walls. The flashlight held. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned her head back against the sofa cushion and looked at the ceiling, which was water-stained in the upper right corner in a pattern that resembled, in the uncertain beam of the flashlight, a map of somewhere she had never been. She was not going to spend the rest of her life being a line item. That was the other thing. Beneath the cold and the exhaustion and the number on the bank app and the 6 remaining days of medication, there was this, small as a pilot light, as persistent as a pilot light, refusing the cold the way those things do. She was not going to let them finish this sentence for her. She didn't know yet what she was going to do instead. But she held the pill organizer like a rosary and counted the days she had left, and outside the mountain wind continued its long, eloquent argument against the old wood, and somewhere in the cabin, the cold pressed against every surface it could find, and she held. She simply held. Friends, thank you so much for staying with Lydia's story this far. In just 4 sequences, we've watched a woman of 68 years lose nearly everything she spent her life building: her home, her security, the dignity she more than earned. Bryce moved fast and he moved ruthlessly, and Lydia arrived at that cold Asheville cabin with $14, a thin blanket, and 6 days of medication. But here's what I want you to hold on to as we go into the second half. Lydia brought something else to that cabin. Something Bryce never accounted for. And it's going to change everything. Don't go anywhere. The most important part of this story and the most satisfying is still ahead. She woke before dawn with a stiff neck and a clear head. Both surprised her. The cold had settled into the cabin overnight with a thoroughness that left her muscles rigid, and her breath visible in the early gray light, but her mind had the particular sharpness that sometimes follows a night of sparse, fitful sleep, as though the body, unable to rest completely, had kept the thinking parts running at a low, productive hum. She sat on the edge of the sofa and looked at the fireplace. And then she remembered. Not all at once. The way memory actually works, not the cinematic rush, but the incremental surfacing, one detail catching on another until the whole shape of a thing emerges from whatever depth it had been resting in. It started with the fireplace itself, the cold stones of it, the way the morning light fell across the irregular surface of the surrounding wall. There was a stone, lower left, that sat slightly proud of its neighbors. A 1/4 inch, perhaps. Enough to catch the eye if you were looking. Enough to catch the hand if you knew where to press. 2021. A Tuesday in October, she was almost certain. One of Edward's rare clear days, the kind that arrived without announcement and departed the same way. Windows of lucidity that she had learned not to waste on sentiment. He had asked her to drive him to the cabin. He had been specific about it in the way he was specific about very few things by then. And she had learned to honor specificity as a form of communication when so many others had closed. He had been quiet most of the drive. That was normal, but when they arrived, he had moved through the cabin with a purposefulness she hadn't seen in months, not the wandering purposefulness of confusion, but the direct, contained movement of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had a limited window in which to get there. He had knelt at the fireplace. She had watched him press the lower left stone, the one that sat slightly proud, with both hands, and it had shifted, and behind it was a space. Not large, the size of a shoebox, roughly. And inside the space, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth she recognized from his old drafting supplies, was a black leather satchel. He had looked up at her from the floor. His eyes were clear. Whatever version of him was present on the clear days, the version that could locate the car keys and remember which medication was which, and say her name with the full weight of 30 years of meaning behind it, that version was fully present in this moment. Kneeling at the hearth of a cold cabin in October with both hands on a piece of oilcloth, looking at her like a man with something important to say and not much time to say it. Don't let Bryce see the logs, Lydia. Promise me. She crossed the room now. The morning light was gray and thin but sufficient. She knelt at the fireplace, her knees registered a formal protest, and found the stone. She pressed it with both palms, the way she had watched him do it, and it shifted. The space was there. The satchel was there. She pulled it out with hands that shook not from cold, but from the specific trembling of a body that has just crossed from one category of situation into another. The leather was stiff with cold, the oilcloth wrapping intact. She unwrapped it on the floor of the cabin, her back against the cold stone of the hearth, and opened the satchel. Inside, notebooks. 3 of them, the black composition kind, filled in Edward's architect's hand. The precise, slightly slanted printing of a man who had spent 50 years communicating in technical documents. She opened the first one and read a date from 2 years ago. And then a name, Bryce, and then a sentence that made the breath leave her body cleanly and completely, the way breath leaves when a fall is broken by something unexpected. And beneath the notebooks a voice recorder. Small, digital, the kind used for dictation. A piece of tape on the back labeled, in the same careful printing, "Play me." She pressed play. His voice filled the cabin. Shaky, yes, the tremor was there, the slight, effortful quality of a man choosing his words carefully against the resistance of a mind that was no longer fully cooperative. But it was Edward. Completely, unmistakably Edward. And what he said, what he had recorded in whatever clear moment he had found, and used with the precision of a man who understood he was running out of them, was not rambling. It was not confused. It was specific and sequential and delivered with the calm authority of a man who had spent a lifetime designing structures intended to stand. He had known what Bryce was doing. He had been watching, logging, building a record, methodically, in the spaces between the confusion, using his good hours the way a craftsman uses the last of the good light. She pressed the recorder to her ear and sat on the cold cabin floor and sobbed into the dust without any attempt at composure. Because there was no one here to compose herself for, and because what she was feeling was too large and too complicated to hold in any other way. He had been watching over her the whole time. Even when he didn't know his own name. Even then, she spent 3 days reading the notebooks. Not because they were long, they were not long, not in the way of books or documents written for an audience. They were the concentrated record of a man working against his own diminishment. Making entries in whatever windows of clarity he could find and use, each one brief and factual and dated with a consistency she found both heartbreaking and galvanizing. He had been keeping this record for nearly 2 years. He had hidden it here, in a cabin Bryce had apparently forgotten existed or considered too insignificant to address, and he had told her on a Tuesday in October. When his mind had surfaced long enough to do the most important thing it had left to do, exactly where to find it. She read every page by firelight. She had found wood on the second morning, a pile of split logs under a tarp on the far side of the cabin, dry enough to use with some coaxing. She had coaxed it. She had discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she still knew how to build a fire. A skill she hadn't actively used since a camping trip in the late 1990s that Edward had organized with great optimism and a borrowed tent. She built it small and efficient, the way useful things are built. And it gave her enough heat to take off the outer layer of her coat and enough light to read by, and that was sufficient. The notebooks documented everything. Bryce's visits, logged by date and content. Conversations about the estate that Edward had been present for and largely silent during, strategically silent, she now understood. Bank transfers that had been initiated with Edward's signature under conditions that the notebooks described, with a doctor's appointment level of observational specificity, as coercive. A trust amendment signing that Edward had recorded in terms that made clear, in his careful printing, that he had known exactly what was in front of him and been told, in language no one could mistake for gentle suggestion, what would happen to Lydia's access to their joint accounts if he did not sign. And the voice recorder had captured one of those conversations. Not all of it, but enough. Bryce's voice on the recording was not the voice he used in offices and on porches. It was the voice he apparently used in rooms where he believed he was the only person who would ever matter. It was efficient and specific and, in its efficiency and specificity, revealed far more about the nature of the enterprise than any amount of legal language in a prenuptial amendment could obscure. She sat at the fireplace on the third evening, a pencil sharpened with a kitchen knife because she had not thought to bring a sharpener, and she made a list. She was good at lists. She had organized the caregiving years with lists, medication schedules, appointment calendars, supply inventories, and she understood their function not as a substitute for thinking, but as a framework within which thinking could occur more productively. She listed what she had. She listed what she needed. She listed, in order, the steps that seemed to stand between her current position and something that more closely resembled justice. At the top of the second column, she wrote attorney. Elder law. She had Googled, briefly, on the final bar of cell service she could find by standing near the front window. with the phone held at a particular angle. Elder Financial Abuse Law, Asheville, North Carolina. The results had included a legal aid office with specific elder law services. She had written down the address in the notebook margin. She had spelled it carefully. She looked at the Medicare card on the table beside the sofa. She had moved it there from her coat pocket during the second day of reading, because she kept reaching for it and finding it, and it kept pulling her attention. She understood now why. It was not what it had seemed to be when Bryce's accounting of her caregiving services was the only framework she had been given. It was not a symbol of diminishment or dependency. It was a record. It was government documentation of her age, her identity, her entitlement to services she had paid into across decades of working life. It was a piece of evidence. She placed it in the satchel beside the notebooks and the recorder. "I will not let them turn his legacy into a crime," she said, quietly, to the crackling fire. She was not given to speaking aloud to empty rooms. She had done it twice now in this cabin, and both times the words had felt necessary, not performative, not self-consoling, but structural. The way you say something out loud to make it real, to move it from the interior category of things. "I am considering to the exterior category of things I have committed to." She was committed. She slept that night with the satchel on the floor beside the sofa, within arm's reach. And she slept better than she had since before Manhattan, not deeply, not without interruption, but with the specific quality of rest that comes when you know what you are going to do in the morning and the morning's task is within your power to undertake. She was up at 6. She washed her face in water that was cold from a tap fed by a gravity-fed tank she'd found behind the cabin, functional, surprisingly, and put on the blazer she had reserved for important meetings. The charcoal one she'd worn to Manhattan and which she now associated with different purposes. She packed the satchel into the canvas bag she'd brought the notebooks in. She put the Medicare card in the front pocket. She drove down the unpaved half-mile road in the early gray light, the sedan rocking over the same ruts she'd navigated 6 days ago in the dark. And she turned onto the county road and drove into Asheville. The legal aid office opened at 8:30. She arrived at 8:15 and sat in the parking lot, watching the building until a light came on in the front room, and then she picked up the canvas bag and got out of the car. The attorney who came out to meet her in the waiting area was young, 34, she would learn. Though she looked younger, with a direct way of moving, and a quality of attention in her expression that Lydia recognized immediately as the kind that meant a person was actually listening rather than merely preparing their response. Her name was Sarah Miller. She specialized, the certificate on her wall confirmed, in elder law and financial abuse. Lydia sat down across from her and placed the canvas bag on the table. "I need to tell you about my husband's notebooks," she said. Sarah Miller did not reach for her pen or her notepad. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Lydia with the full, unhurried attention of someone who understood that the next thing she was about to hear mattered, and was prepared to let it matter. "Tell me everything," she said. The morning light came through the front window of the legal aid office in long, thin bars, and Lydia Thorne opened the canvas bag and began. She had stopped being afraid somewhere between the fireplace and the parking lot. She was not precisely sure of the moment. What she had replaced the fear with was something cleaner and more efficient and far better suited to what came next. She recognized it, the way you recognize an old competency you haven't needed in a while. The particular clarity of a person who has organized the variables, identified the path, and is prepared to do the necessary work. She had enough to burn the whole world down, and she intended to use every last bit of it wisely. The Westchester County Courthouse had the particular gravity of old civic buildings, the weight of marble floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, the high ceilings that gathered sound and returned it subtly altered, the quality of light through tall windows that made everything inside feel both consequential and slightly removed from the ordinary passage of time. Lydia had been in this building once before, 39 years ago, when she and Edward had filed a minor property dispute with a neighbor over a fence line. She remembered waiting in a wooden chair in a hallway, while Edward talked to a clerk, and thinking that the building smelled like old paper and something she hadn't been able to name. She named it now, standing in the corridor outside the courtroom with Sarah at her side. It smelled like accountability. The case had taken 4 months to build and 11 minutes to schedule. Sarah had known, from the first morning in the Asheville Legal Aid Office, that what Lydia had brought in the canvas bag was not a grievance, it was a case. The notebooks alone would have been compelling a meticulous, dated record in the hand of a man who had spent 50 years communicating in technical documents. Documenting coercive conduct with the observational precision of someone who understood that details matter. With the voice recording, it became something that prosecuting attorneys in Westchester described, in the precise language of their profession, as unusually strong. Sarah had also found, in Edward's original estate documentation, the unamended version, the one Bryce had apparently believed was the only copy that mattered. A provision that had been drafted not by Edward's estate attorney but by Edward himself. In a separate handwritten addendum attached with a paperclip, witnessed and notarized by a neighbor in 2019, when his mind had still been largely his own. The provision established a life estate in the Westchester property for Lydia, unconditionally, for the duration of her life. It predated the amendment. It was, Sarah explained with a quietness that contained a great deal of satisfaction, legally unambiguous. Bryce had not known about it. Edward had been a meticulous man. He had designed structures for 50 years. He understood, better than most people, the difference between a load-bearing element and decorative trim. And he had constructed the provisions for Lydia's protection the way he would have constructed anything important, with redundancy, with foresight. And with the specific care of a person who understood that the thing he was building might one day need to stand without him. The courtroom was full. Lydia had not expected that. She had imagined something smaller. The legal procedures Sarah described could have been managed in a less formal setting, she thought, but the hearing on the estate fraud investigation had drawn people, and the gallery behind the barrier was occupied with a concentration of faces she recognized only in partial ways. Some were Westchester neighbors. Some were people she did not know at all, who had apparently followed the case as it appeared in the local court filings. In the front row behind the defense table, Bryce's attorney, a man who had arrived that morning with the compressed energy of someone who had been given new information. He did not welcome and had not yet fully processed what it meant for his approach. Bryce sat at the defense table. He was dressed as he always dressed, impeccably, the wool coat over the chair back, the dark trousers, the expensive footwear that had stood on her porch while he held an envelope with a deed to a drafty cabin. He was not looking at the gallery. He was looking at the table with the focused blankness of a man working very hard to appear composed. Sarah played the recording. The courtroom, which had not been entirely quiet before, became completely quiet. Edward's voice, shaky with effort but unmistakably deliberate, filled the space with the specific intimacy of a private moment made suddenly, irreversibly public. And then Bryce's voice, efficient, specific, the pressure of it audible even through the slightly compressed quality of the digital recording. The voice of a man in a room where he believed he was the only person who would ever matter. Speaking to a father whose mind he had concluded was no longer a factor requiring serious consideration. He had been wrong about that. Lydia watched Bryce's face while the recording played. She was not doing it to witness his discomfort. She had not come here for spectacle, whatever other people in the gallery might have come for. She was watching his face because she had spent decades reading faces in difficult rooms. And she understood them as the primary source of true information in any situation where the spoken content was managed. His face went gray. Not metaphorically, there was an actual physiological change, a draining of color at the cheeks and the area around his mouth. The specific pallor of a body whose circulatory system has received news that requires immediate redistribution of resources. When the recording ended, Sarah rose and presented the original estate provision. The handwritten addendum, witnessed and notarized, the one Edward had prepared with his own hand in 2019. The judge, a woman in her late 50s whose expression throughout the proceedings had been difficult to read but whose attention had been complete, examined it for a long moment. She asked Bryce's attorney a question. His answer was careful and not particularly helpful to his client. The gavel came down. The amendment was voided. The life estate provision reinstated. Bryce's assets were ordered frozen pending a full investigation by the district attorney's office into the estate fraud. A process that, Sarah had explained quietly in the corridor before they entered, could have substantial consequences if the investigation progressed as the preliminary evidence suggested it would. Lydia stood at the podium when the judge gave her the opportunity to address the court directly. She had not prepared remarks. She had thought about preparing them and then decided against it. Because she had spent 4 months reading documents and medical records and legal frameworks and the careful notebooks of a man working against his own mind to protect her. And she had reached the conclusion that the most honest thing she could offer this room was simply what was true. For 38 years, she said, I cared for my husband. Not as an employee, not as a service provider, not as a line item in an estate calculation. She paused. Behind her, the courtroom was entirely still. I cared for him because I loved him, and because loving someone, in my understanding, means that you stay when the staying is difficult. You show up at 3 in the morning. You learn to read the language of someone whose language is changing. You build your life around theirs, not because you expect compensation, but because that is what you promised. She had not intended to pause again, but she did, because the next sentence required the full weight of her intention behind it. Today, she said, the law remembered what my husband never forgot. The gallery was quiet for a moment after she stepped back from the podium. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, someone began to clap, a single person, and then two. And then the sound broadened in the way that collective things do when they've found their beginning, and she stood at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded in front of her and did not look at the gallery but at the front of the room, at the judge's bench, where the woman in her late 50s was writing something in the case notes with the focused attention of a person recording something worth recording. Sarah touched her arm, briefly, with the light pressure of a person communicating something too complex for words and too simple to require them. The gavel came down again, formally closing the session. Lydia gathered her folder from the table, the documents. The copies Sarah had prepared, the careful, redundant record of everything that mattered, and she put her coat on. She walked down the aisle between the gallery rows. People stepped aside. She was aware of their faces in her peripheral vision, aware of the quality of attention they were paying. But she kept her focus forward, on the tall doors at the back of the courtroom, on the light coming through the narrow windows beside them. She passed the defense table without slowing. Bryce did not look up. The heavy doors opened with a weight that surprised her, or perhaps the weight was simply the counterpart to how they had felt on the way in. On the way in, they had been the doors to a room where something was going to happen. On the way out, they were just doors. Light. She stood on the top step of the courthouse, and the November air came at her clean and cold, and the sky above Westchester was the flat, careful gray she had always associated with introspection, the sky that asked you to sit with things. She had sat with enough. She had sat with the granite island and the Medicare envelopes and the mahogany table, and the cabin floor and the thin blanket and the $14.12. She had sat with all of it, and she had held, and she was standing on these steps in the cold November light, with 40 years of paperwork that had finally protected her instead of erasing her. The sweetest music, she thought, is not always musical. Spring came to Asheville the way it comes to mountain places, not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm week, then a cold snap, then a morning when the light through the cabin windows had a quality distinctly different from the gray compression of winter. Something looser and more generous, and she stepped outside with her coffee, and found that the ground along the south side of the cabin had begun, quietly and without announcement, to do something green. She had been back since February. The utility service had been restored. The porch boards had been reinforced. A retired contractor 2 properties down the road had done it in an afternoon for the cost of lunch and conversation, both of which she had been glad to provide. The wallpaper in the main room was still peeling in the upper left corner, but she had come to consider it a kind of record, the cabin before, the cabin after, and had decided to let it stand rather than cover it. The garden had been her idea, but it had become, almost immediately, a community effort. She had started it in the space along the front fence, a stretch of ground that received good morning sun and had been growing nothing but determined weeds since before she arrived. She had cleared it herself, over 3 days in late March, on her knees in the cold soil with gardening gloves she had bought at the hardware store in town and a trowel that had been in the cabin's shed, discovered during her third week when she had finally worked up the motivation to investigate the shed properly. She planted what she could grow from seed at that elevation and that time of year: spinach, kale, early lettuces. Practical things. Things that would yield something you could eat. By the second week of April, 3 women from the road had asked if they could add to it. By the first week of May, the garden had expanded to cover the entire front fence line and a portion of the side yard, and it contained, in addition to the practical things, a rosebush in the corner that had been contributed by a woman named Dorothea, who was 71 and had strong opinions about what a garden needed to be complete. Lydia was inclined to agree. She sat on the porch, now the repaired porch, with its restored boards and its southern exposure and its view of the Appalachian foothills going blue with distance, with a clipboard in her lap and a pen that worked. The document on the clipboard was a charter. She had drafted it over the course of 2 weeks, in conversation with Sarah and with several of the women who had been coming to the garden. And it established formally what had been forming informally since the first morning she had driven into town with a canvas bag and a voice recorder. A senior advocacy group, organized under Asheville's existing nonprofit framework, dedicated specifically to the financial and legal protection of elderly women. Navigating estate disputes, inheritance challenges, and the particular category of exploitation that the law was only beginning, she had come to understand, to take seriously. She signed her name at the bottom of the charter document, not quickly, not with the reflexive speed of a signature applied to something you haven't fully read, but deliberately, with the fullness of attention the moment deserved. Lydia Thorne. Bold and clear. From inside the cabin came the sound of the kettle, and then the sound of Dorothea telling someone to mind the edge of the table. And then laughter, the specific laughter of women who have discovered, at a point in their lives when the world has been somewhat insistent, that they are finished, that they are not finished at all, and who find this discovery both satisfying and slightly funny. They gathered on Tuesday afternoons now, on the porch when the weather allowed, and around the fireplace, the same fireplace, the one with the loose stone when it didn't. 8 women, currently, ranging in age from Lydia's 68 to Dorothea's 71, to a woman named Patricia, who was 83 and who had spent 20 years in family court as a paralegal and whose institutional knowledge of elder law was, as Sarah had noted with genuine admiration, approximately equivalent to a law degree, with better practical judgment. They drank tea and they talked, and what they talked about was both specific and enormous: their money, their housing, their legal standing, their rights, the gap between what the law technically provided and what a person without representation could actually access. They talked about the ways in which the overlooked generation, Dorothea's phrase, and a good one, had been taught to be quietly grateful for whatever they received, and to frame their own erasure as a form of modesty. They were done with that particular form of modesty. The advocacy group had already assisted 3 women in Buncombe County with referrals to Sarah's network of elder law attorneys. One of those 3 was in the process of challenging a guardianship arrangement that looked, to Patricia's experienced eye, considerably more convenient for the guardian than for the person being guarded. The work was slow and unglamorous and entirely necessary. Lydia looked at her new bank statement on the small table beside the porch chair. She had put it there that morning when it arrived and had then immediately looked away from it, toward the garden. The legal settlement, the voiding of Bryce's amendments, the restoration of her life estate, the back disbursements ordered as part of the fraud investigation's preliminary conclusions had produced a number that was not the number of her former life. It would never be that number. But it was a number that meant medication refilled and utilities paid, and the shed roof repaired before next winter, and enough left over to see the advocacy group's operating budget for its first year. It was enough. It was, she had discovered across the last several months, enough. The roses in the corner of the garden were beginning. She could see them from where she sat, the first unfurlings of Dorothea's rosebush. The bud casings gone soft and slightly parted at the tips, the color inside not quite visible yet but promised. She put the pen down on the clipboard. At 68, she said, quietly, to the mountains and the garden and the Appalachian afternoon light that was going golden now across the tops of the trees. I finally learned that starting over isn't failure. She touched the arm of the porch chair. She felt the wood old, warm from the afternoon sun, slightly rough under her palm in the way of things that have weathered something and held. She had spent a lot of time in this life touching surfaces. Cold marble countertops and mahogany table edges and plastic pill organizers and loose stones in cabin fireplaces and courtroom podiums and cool garden soil. Every surface had told her something. The cool marble had told her about the silence of an ending. The garden soil told her about something else entirely. The kettle called again. She gathered the clipboard and stood. The door to the cabin was warm on the handle. Inside, Dorothea was passing cups, and Patricia was explaining something to the newest member of the group. A woman named June, 66, who had arrived the previous Tuesday with a manila folder and the particular expression of someone who has recently discovered that a thing they thought was solid has no floor, and the fireplace was going and the window over the sink let in the late sun, and the room smelled of tea and wood smoke and the faint, good smell of the earth from 8 pairs of gardening gloves drying on the hooks by the door. She set the signed charter on the table among the teacups and the manila folders and the reading glasses. And the accumulated evidence of women who were, collectively and individually, not done. She was Lydia Thorne. She had built a marriage and tended a life and survived the dismantling of both and driven 7 hours alone in the dark to a cold cabin on a mountain and found, behind a loose stone in a fireplace, the record of a love precise enough to outlast the mind that held it. She had stood in a courtroom and spoken the truth in a clear voice to a room full of people, and the room had listened. She had cleared a fence line in the cold and planted things that grew. She touched the soil on the windowsill, a small clay pot with a start of something green she'd brought in from the garden. The first seedling she'd transplanted, nothing fancy, and felt the cool, living earth beneath her fingernails, and thought about provision. About what it meant, truly, to be provided for. Not the account balance and not the deed to a house and not the name on a document, but this, the warmth of a room where you are known. The work that is yours to do. The woman you become, in the woods, when everything that was not essential has been stripped away and you find out what's left. What was left was considerable. She picked up her teacup and joined the others at the table, and outside the garden went on doing what gardens do in the late afternoon light of an Appalachian spring. Quietly, purposefully, in the fullness of its own time. Friends, how did you find today's story? I've been sitting with Lydia's story since we began, and I have to tell you there's something about it that stays. Not just the injustice of what Bryce did, or the satisfaction of watching the courtroom hear Edward's voice for the last time in the way it deserved to be heard. It's something quieter than that. Something about a woman of 68 years, sitting in the dark on a moth-eaten sofa, with a flashlight and $14, holding a pill organizer like a rosary, and simply refusing to be finished. We talk a lot, in stories like this, about justice. And Lydia got her justice: the life estate restored, the amendment voided, the investigation moving forward. That part mattered. The legal machinery doing what it should have done from the start, that mattered. But I keep thinking about the moment she knelt at the fireplace and pressed that stone. Edward had been watching over her the whole time. Logging, recording, building a record in whatever clear hours he had left, not because he was bitter, not because he wanted to fight, but because he understood that the person he loved would need evidence when he was no longer there to speak for her. That is love with the architecture of a good building designed to stand after the builder is gone. And Lydia took everything that was done to her, every humiliation and every cold night and every $14 moment, and she turned it into fuel. Not for revenge, for something better than revenge. For a room full of women around a fireplace on Tuesday afternoons, doing the work that someone should have been doing all along. We all face moments where we have to decide who we are when everything we relied on has been taken away. When the floor drops out and the accounts are empty and the house is being measured around us while we stand in it. Those moments ask a question. Lydia's answer was the garden, and the charter, and her name signed clearly at the bottom. I hope this story brought you a little comfort, and something to hold on to. Because it is never too late to press the stone. To find what was hidden there for you. To discover, in the woods or wherever your cabin is, the woman who was waiting, the one who has been there, steady and intact, through all of it. Thank you for being here, friends. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or of something in yourself, please hit subscribe, and give it a like. It means more than you know, And it helps us keep telling the stories that matter.